Good morning, guys. Sorry if I cannot make it today on a live session, but I recorded the video to give you the lecture, and I want you to listen carefully because a bit of announcement. Um, your exam would be on Friday. That would be September 16 in the afternoon. I am not particularly sure what time it would be, pero sa hapon. Lecture would be 70 items and 50 items for the laboratory. So you're gonna take the exam simultaneously. Uh, you expect the lab and the lecture to be done both in the afternoon. Okay? What to expect with the exam? I'm going to give a multiple choice and true or false. No identification, that's for sure, and no essay. But I'll tell you ahead that the exam might be difficult. You need to read and you need to study. Okay, so I'm going to continue. Previously we're done with introductions of anatomy, and we talk about the um, the planes, the cavities, the organ system. Okay, so right now we're gonna talk about the homeostasis. Okay, so I would start. So when we see homeostasis, so this is the condition of equilibrium or the balance in the body. Basically, when you say homeostasis, it's just a balance or equilibrium. Okay, in the body's internal environment due to a constant interaction of the body's many regulatory processes. So usually homeostasis is a dynamic condition. Okay, because every day we move, every day we do a lot of things, and every day we interact with the environment, whether it would be harsh or not, or favorable to our human body. Okay, in hemostasis there are principles. We call that the feedback system. Okay, and the feedback system, so this is a loop, or it is a cycle. So it is events which the status of the body or condition of the body is monitored, evaluated, it is changed, it is remonitored, and it is re-evaluated again. Like what I've said, it's a cycle, it's a loop, paulit-ulit. Okay, this is what happens in our body from day to day. Now we have this is what we call the loop that I was referring to you. I will zoom it out. Okay, so we start with a stimulus. Okay, so stimulus, any stimulus would do. Okay, let's say pag sinampal ka ng kasintahan mo, that is a stimulus. Or nakatapa ka na tamtax, that is a stimulus. A light in your eyes, that is a stimulus. A heat of the sun, that is a stimulus. Okay, so every stimulus that disrupts the homeostasis, either by increasing or decreasing a controlled condition, so that is what we call, for example, the heat of the sun. Okay, the heat of the sun, it is a temperature. So when you say temperature, if masyadong mainit, so what will happen? Okay, so there would be I'll make the example, the heat of the sun, yung init. Okay, the temperature. So there would be the receptors, so that is monitored by the receptors. The heat of the sun, the receptors is our skin. Okay, it is the body structure that monitors the change or the controlled condition. For example, sa heat of the sun or yung init, that is what we call the temperature. Okay, so now these receptors will proceed to its pathway. Usually we call it the afferent pathway. Afferent means towards our body, going to the brain. When we say efferent, it's from the brain going out. Okay, so the receptors will send nerve impulse or chemical signals to the control center, which is the control center is our brain. Okay, Now, the brain will give signals that at this time it will be a efferent pathway na, because from the brain going back to the effector, okay, going to the end effect, okay. So usually the effector is the body structure that receives the output from control center to the response, okay. Now, in our skin, what will happen pag nainitan ka, your body temperature, you need to like control the body temperature. Your brain will signal going to your sweat glands, and your sweat glands will release water. Water will cool down your skin, okay. That's why we are sweating, okay. Hindi tayo nag-sweat because um, we are kinakabahan, something like that, or parang kasi it's a normal con. We are sweating because we are going to control our body temperature, okay. So then the effector that bring about the change, it will respond again para to control the condition. No, let's say yung temperature, no, the temperature will control this condition, so the temperature will now be controlled. Let's say siyempre sa mainit, it will control the temperature. Now it will return to homeostasis, or what we call again the balance, okay. So that will happen. That usually happens in a normal way of life that's happening to us, okay. Next, in a feedback system, we have two feedback system. We have the negative and the positive feedback. When we say negative feedback, so this is a reverse or a change in the controlled condition, okay. I will give you the example later on. Unlike negative feedback, a positive feedback system tends to strengthen, or it will reinforce, or it will push through the change in one body's condition, okay. When you're going to be asked, ano ba ang mas pangit, the negative feedback or the positive feedback? Okay, the positive feedback, because if there's already a harsh environment and there is a harsh stimulus, usually the positive feedback will not reverse it, unless, for example, in the negative feedback, if there's a harsh stimulus, it will reverse that so that it could go back to a controlled condition, okay. Now, so this is a one example of a negative feedback, okay. So there's a stimulus, so disrupt yung homeostasis ng body natin, and then one example is the blood pressure. Let's say nag-increase yung blood pressure. So yung receptors, usually the blood vessels, okay, the baroreceptors of our blood vessels, now it will tell our brain na, uy, mataas yung blood pressure mo, okay, nasa 100, let's say 200 over 100, okay. So let's say the brain will go to certain and organs, like for example at the heart, or go back to the blood vessels, okay. Usually the blood vessels, let's say the blood vessels, we have what we call beta agonist, no. What will happen, it will, since the pressures increase, the blood vessels will try to dilate, okay, so that the pressure will go down. In terms of the heart na naman, okay, when there's increased blood pressure, there is increasing amount of blood being pumped out, okay. There's increased workload of the heart. So what will happen, because of the negative feedback, the brain will tell, oy, can you please decrease your workload para hindi mag-increase yung blood pressure. So yun na yun. Well, it states here na there is a decreased heart rate and dilation of the blood vessels, so that the blood pressure will decrease, okay. There's also one response regarding this, that what we call the RAAS system, or the renin angiotensin aldosterone system, okay. What it does, it signals going na naman to the end organ, which is the kidneys, okay. So the kidneys produces the renin, will convert renin into a angiotensin 1 to the lungs, going to angiotensin 2, which is a very potent vasodilator. Okay, so once it's a very potent vasodilator, it goes to the blood vessel and it will dilate. Okay, yun yung one example din yun. And then after that, kung nag-dilate, it decrease yung blood pressure, so it will return to homeostasis, so the blood pressure go back to normal, and balik na naman sa controlled condition, which is a normal blood pressure. Okay? Now, let's go to positive feedback. When it's one example of a positive feedback is yung normal birth. Okay? So, there is pag nanganganak na, let's say, in a late phase or an active phase of labor. So, there is already contractions of the uterine wall. So, because the baby really wants to go out. Okay? So, in a controlled condition, there would be stretching of the cervix. Now, the receptors, which is what we call the stretch sensitive sa cervix, because usually pag yung ulo ng bata, it will really push the cervix. Okay? Now, hindi naman pwedeng i-reverse because pinupush yung cervix, mag-stop, hindi na makakalabas yung bata. Okay? So, what the input would be to the brain is sabihin niya, okay, we need to push it more. Okay? So, we need to increase the contraction. So, what will happen is the brain will release oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland. So, mag-release ng oxytocin, so that usually oxytocin will bind to the uterine wall cells and it will increase its contraction. So, magko-contract pa fully para maglabas yung baby. Okay, so the baby body stretches to the cervix more hanggang sa lumabas. Usually, if there's an interruption with this cycle, okay, so hindi nag-open yung cervix, there's no cervical dilation. So, magbibreak yung feedback cycle. That's the time mangyayari what they call yung arrest in cervical dilation. Okay, that is already a abnormal phase of labor. Okay. Moreover, okay, let me continue. So, if there's already increased stretching of the cervix, so causes the release of more oxytocin, so and results in stretching more of the cervix that causes to dilate para makalabas yung ulo ng bata. Okay, so that is what we call going back to controlled condition, which is the stretching of the cervix. Okay, kasi kailangan mag-stretch ang cervix. Usually, the maximum stretching of the cervix is 10 centimeters. Ganito kalaki. Enough para sa ulo ng bata lumabas. Okay? Sige, so we're done with the negative and the positive feedback. So, I will continue to the cellular level of anatomy. This is already in the physiology part. We already discussed in our laboratory the cell. We already enumerated the structures and already said their functions. Okay, so there are certain part here that you really need to know. Okay, I want you to read more the chapter about, you don't have to I skipped chapter 2 because that's more on your biochemistry na. Okay, so it will be like redundant and we are pressing time before the prelims, so I am tackling about the most important thing, okay, in the cellular level, the physiology and the cells. Okay, so this is more on the physiology because we're already done sa laboratory natin in terms of the anatomy. Okay, so what are the functions of the cell? Okay, so cell metabolism. Okay, number 1. So, when you say metabolism, I explained it in my previous lectures that metabolism uses energy. Okay? So, there is chemical reaction that produces energy. Okay? Then, next is synthesis of molecules. So, cell synthesizes various types of molecules such as proteins, nucleic acid, lipids. Okay? Communication, like what I've said before, di ba? One cell to another communicate. Okay? Usually, they communicate through their vesicles, okay? Or they communicate through molecules they send to each other, or they communicate through their cilias, di ba? Usually, they also communicate by using electrical signals, okay? If you, one good example of that is a nerve cell. So, you have, di ba, mahaba masyado yan. You see a nerve na mahaba. So, usually, biceps, magkakadugtong-dugtong lahat yan sila. Okay? Reproduction and inheritance. So, cells carry genetic information, genetic materials, okay? But except for RBCs doesn't contain nucleus, so they doesn't, like I think I answered who was that, doesn't contain genetic material, but erythroblast, which is the precursor of erythrocyte or the RBCs, those are the one that holds the what do you call this, the genetic material. Okay? When you say reproduction, okay, they undergo mitosis or meiosis, so such as when the sperm cell and the egg cell what do you call this, fertilizes. So doon na magkakaroon ng mitosis. Cells will divide, reproduce, so that it could make a human being. Okay, this is the most important. Okay, the cell membrane. Okay, we know that the cell membrane is the outermost component of the cell. Okay, you need to know that this is very important. Okay, that outside of the cell are called extracellular. When you say inside, it is called intracellular. Okay? You will encounter this term a lot of times. There are lots of questions that's gonna be asked regarding these terms when you go into advanced stages of this course or other subjects. If you don't understand the very simple term of extra and intracellular, mahihirapan kayo. Okay? So, we know that cell membrane, okay, is a phospholipid bilayer. Two layers. Because it has the outside layer, the head, and the inside layer or the intracellular layer. Okay? So, usually, in a cell membrane, there are movements of molecules inside going outside, outside going inside. Okay? You always need to remember, okay, this is very common, okay, that the outside of the cell contains higher concentration of sodium. Okay? That's why I'm saying yung piso. Always remember piso. That sodium is outside, okay? And P or potassium is inside. Okay? Remember that. Okay? Because this was a board, I remember this was a board question long ago. Nung nag-board exam ako somewhere in 2000 basta. So, you need to know that the higher concentration of potassium is inside, intracellularly, and sodium extracellularly. Okay? That's why it's piso. Okay. Now, like what I've said, there are transport happening, molecular transport, molecules being transported extracellularly, going intracellularly. So there are types of transport. So the passive membrane transport, which composes of diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion, and active membrane transport, like active transport, secondary active transport, endocytosis, and exocytosis. Now, the question is, anong pinagkaiba ng dalawa? Okay, when we say passive membrane transport, it does the only difference between two is the ATP or energy. passive membrane transport doesn't require ATP at all, okay, to happen. Active membrane transport requires ATP to happen. It will not happen if there's no ATP. Okay? ATP is adenosine triphosphate. It is the energy inside the cell. Okay? Now, so these are the types and the characteristic of movement across membranes. Okay? So solutes such as ions, molecules, so they tend to move from the area from higher concentration going to a lower concentration. Okay? So that's what we call diffusion. Okay? So usually this is a passive, so that doesn't require ATP. So this picture is an example of diffusion. Diffusion means nag-diffuse siya. Okay? So parang kasi parang there is one higher concentration going into a lower, pupunta siya doon so that it could parang magiging magkakaroon ng equilibrium or parang magkakaroon ng equal concentration gradient. Okay? So example, you put a salt in a water, then mapansin mo yung water, yung salt will diffuse, so mapupuno na yung ions ng salt will and water molecules will usually distribute evenly. Okay? Next is osmosis. Okay? Osmosis. When we say osmosis, it is the diffusion of water across a permeable membrane. So there is a membrane, okay, such as yung, well, the cell membrane. So from a region of higher concentration to a lower water concentration. Okay? So when we say osmosis, dapat ang papasok sa isip niyo parate is water. Okay? Water from higher concentration going to a lower concentration. Okay? So there are what we call yung mga pressure, okay, and osmosis. We have the osmotic pressure. So this is force required to prevent the movement of water across a selective permeable membrane. So this is what we call, it has the pulling force, okay? Pinupull niya. Okay? Hydrostatic pressure naman is pushing force of water due to the presence of more fluid, okay, in one region to another. Okay, so for example, there is more region at the extracellular space. If you increase water on the extracellular space, okay, so magkakaroon ng pressure, it will now push water towards inside the cell in the intracellular space. Okay, kaya nagkakaroon ngayon ng swelling. Okay, you will understand it. I will explain it to you further. Okay, so ito yung example. There are types of fluid solutions, yung mga IV fluids natin. So, bakit ba merong iba-ibang color ng IV fluids? Okay, because there are isotonic, hypotonic, and hypertonic. Okay, isotonic means it's just same concentration ng water and solutes. Hypotonic, lower ang concentration of solutes, more water. Hypertonic, higher concentration of solutes, less water. Okay, now nung sinabi ko sa'yo about hydrostatic pressure, example, now let's say in the RBC, okay, if you put a hypertonic if you put a hypotonic solution sa cells, sa RBCs, okay, what will happen is, since there is more water outside, okay, increasing water, so what will happen, there will be a increased hydrostatic pressure. So what will happen, the increased water will now go to the cell. That's why the cell will shrink. Okay? Mag-shrink siya, mapupuno siya ngayon ng tubig. Okay? Yun ang mayayari. So, pag magpuno siya, it will burst. Okay? On an isotonic solution, there is no osmosis happening kasi same lang yung solutes and yung water. Kasi isotonic siya. On hypertonic naman, so what will happen is, yung osmotic pressure naman, okay? Kasi increase yung solutes. It will pull out the water outside. Okay? So that's why what will happen to the cells, it will now shrink. Okay? Or we call this creatination. Okay? So that's the difference between the hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. That's why it's very, very important that you would know this by heart. The isotonic, the hypotonic, the hypertonic. It's really simple. If you try to read it in the books, parang masyadong mahirap. Pero, isotonic is just same concentration. Plain NSS or plain sodium chloride solution. We have the plain lactate linear solution. Okay. Hypotonic, we have the D45 dextrose, 45% sodium chloride. In hypertonics, we have the what we call this, the D5LR, D5 NSS. Okay, so those are the solutions that you need. So every disease then requires, dapat alam nyo kung ano yung fluids ginagamit. As a nurse, it's the bread and butter of nurses to memorize fluid dynamics and fluids. Kasi patients will always say, this is just very simple, pero parang ganito talaga mangyari. Nurse, ang dextrose ni patient nga na hurot na. Nurse, unsa, pwede pa dextrose na lang ni, pwede pa kung dextrose. Okay. So, dextrose in layman's term is fluids. Okay. Now, if you don't know kung anong fluids ang binigay mo sa patient, pwede siyang madisgrasya. Okay? If you give fluids na hypertonic solution sa nagdadiarrhea, okay, imbis na bigyan mo siya ng more water to the cells because they are dehydrated, mas lalo silang madidehydrate. If you give hypotonic solutions sa mga patients that having cellular edemas because of chronic kidney disease, chronic kidney failures, or having patients with congestive heart failures, okay, that they cannot control their water, or having patients with liver problems, so mas lalo mo silang lulunurin. You will congest the patients. Okay? Usually, isotonic solutions are very safe. But, not all the time. Because pag yung mga patients mong nasobrahan naman din ng fluid, binigyan mo ng isotonic and you're not regulating your IV fluids, yung patient also might die. Okay? So, we go now with what we call facilitated diffusion. So, a facilitated diffusion, okay, usually these are carrier mediated. When we say carrier mediated, ibig sabihin parang meron siyang nag-cargo nagadala sa kanya. One molecule needs cargo para mag-move yung substance across the cell. Okay? So, diba? Yan. Ito. For example, this is a carrier on glucose. If your glucose wants to go in inside your cell, okay, it needs to have a what you call it, a carrier molecule. Usually, sa glucose, it is what we call the sodium gradient carrier. Okay, so usually this requires a sodium before siya makapasok. Kung walang sodium, hindi siya makakapasok. Okay? So, next is this one, active transport. Okay, now active transport, it's also carrier mediated. So, meron din siyang tinatawag na parang other substance for it to move inside. So from a lower concentration going to a higher concentration. Okay? So usually active transport, like what I've said earlier, it requires energy to happen. Kung walang energy, walang ATP, hindi, it will not happen. Okay? So this one, this is a sodium potassium pump. Okay? For the potassium to go inside, okay? Kasi 'di ba alam naman natin na for the potassium to go outside, okay? Kasi alam naman natin na potassium is inside the cell and sodium is outside. Or if there's exchanges, so there should be a pump going on. If there's a pump, there should be energy doing the pump. Okay? So that there would be equilibrium in regards to the concentration. Lapit na tayo. So, endocytosis. Endocytosis, when you say endo, there are two, endo and exo. Endo means into the cell. Okay? So, actually, endocytosis is an uptake of a material. One good example of it is yung tinatawag nating phagocytosis. Okay? So, usually there's ingestion of particles. Okay? Usually, for example, one good example ng endocytosis or the phagocytosis, if yung WBC will engulf, okay, a bacteria para kainin niya and will make a phagocyte. Okay? That process is called what we call phagocytosis. So, this is one example. Usually, when a cell like growth hormone or cholesterols going inside the cell, so it needs to undergo process of endocytosis. Okay, so exocytosis naman, so I've already explained it to you before, diba? These are vesicles, okay, secretory vesicles formed by the Golgi apparatus. Okay, so secretory vesicles membranes, so they usually make they fuse with other cells. Okay, so they are released into the extracellular space or fluid. So one good example of this is yung exocytosis. Production of salivary glands. Okay? Your glands produces saliva. Ganun. Or digestive enzymes produced by the pancreas. So, those are examples. Okay? So, this should be the end of our lecture. If you have any questions regarding the lecture, you can type at the chat box. I will answer you today. Pwede kayong mag-chat sa group chat. Okay? I'm not going to give, because of time, I'm not going to give a quiz anymore. But because it's already, I think, we are going to have our last lecture. But kasi I need to take a look kung isasali ko ba yung integumentary system for the prelims, because that would be there's still lectures on Monday and Tuesday, and our exam is on Friday. Pag isasali ko yung lecture, it will be just the integumentary system. So we will touch integumentary system the next lecture, and then it will be part of the exam. Remember, the exam would be 70 items lecture and 50 items laboratory. Okay? So mostly multiple choice and true or false. So, and it will be time pressured. Kasi maybe there are also some kind of a parang identification, but in a form of multiple choice, like sample question. The powerhouse of the cell is A. Golgi apparatus, B, mitochondria, mga ganon na klaseng question. So, those would be bonus questions. Okay? So, thank you and have a nice weekend ahead.